2,000 years ago, a young Jewish woman in Roman-occupied Palestine had a baby. Other than a few stories, we know almost nothing about her life, and yet today she is one of the most recognized and venerated women in the world, Mary, the Mother of God. Today we call her Star of the Sea, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, Our Lady of Charity. But before all those titles, she was simply Miriam, Mary of Nazareth.
For centuries after her death, Christians, especially Catholic and Orthodox Christians, developed layers of doctrines and devotions regarding Mary. Many of these fit neatly into patriarchal expectations of womanhood and motherhood, ideas that Mary was demure, pure, and virginal.
Yet despite her whitewashing, in many cases literally, Mary keeps appearing among people who are oppressed or outcast. She repeatedly appears to those on society's edges. Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared to the indigenous peasant Juan Diego. Our Lady of Fatima appeared to 3 young shepherd children. We have stories of Mary rescuing those lost at sea and protecting queer Catholics from violence.
She's also become a rallying figure in moments of political resistance. Cesar Chavez, during the 1960s March for Farm Workers' Rights, carried an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. When the Chilean and Argentinian governments were kidnapping dissenters in the 1970s, Mary became known as Mother of the Disappeared. In colonialized India, the British Empire banned the Magnificat for its revolutionary language.
So, for the season finale of Glad You Asked, we're bringing you a special 3-part series on Mary as a figure of liberation. We talked to 3 Marian scholars from different disciplines, all of whom have a different perspective on Mary and the role she plays in our religious and political imagination today. Today, a look at how Mary has been used to challenge patriarchal structures. Can we call Mary a feminist? That's the question for this episode of Glad You Asked.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer.
So, Emily, I'm curious about what your background is coming to this conversation, because depending on what kind of Christianity one has been brought up with, one might have very different kind of grounding expectations about Mary.
I was trying to think about what I learned about Mary growing up, and I can't actually remember anything. I know my mom wrote a book about Mary that was supposed to be a biography of Mary that was published by a small Christian press. So I think I knew that Mary was young, that she was a teenager. I think I knew she wasn't white. But really, until I was in college, I had never really thought much about Mary, to be quite honest. And it wasn't really until I was an adult that I started really kind of reclaiming Mary as a figure to emulate or to model or to look up to.
Now that you've asked that question, I'm racking my brain and trying to recall what I knew about Mary before my family became Catholic. And I know I thought of her as a Jewish woman because of my Jewish family connections. But the Protestant side of the family, they're just outside of Christmas and nativity scenes, there just wasn't a whole lot of conversation about her. And then once I got into Catholic culture, it was in a world that was really hardcore, pushing the Mary was submissive, Mary was meek, Mary was obedient, be like Mary. So honestly, I didn't like Mary. I felt like she was being used as this figure to shame me for not being that way. Even though I was super into the whole conservative thing, I still kind of resented that.
I do wish that we taught children about the revolutionary Mary, the Mary that is someone to emulate, to follow, as she quite literally sings about, making sure everyone has enough food to eat and enough power to share.
This is a great point, and I think it highlights how easily we approach texts with a kind of predetermined hermeneutic about how we're going to read them. Because I was sitting there reading the Bible cover to cover several times before I even went to college, and I'm still seeing Mary through this lens of submissive, not subversive. The Magnificat was right there in front of me, and I was still kind of yep, obedient, meek, mild, not someone I would want to hang out with. And then once you actually go back to the text and you read it, even though, yeah, she doesn't show up a whole lot in the Bible, but she does show up in the tradition of a whole lot of women who weren't exactly meek and submissive. And she stands out as I think part of that tradition and not counter to it.
I think it also says something about who wrote the Bible, who gets to interpret the Bible too, right? I think back to when I was in grad school, and I went to Yale Divinity School, so this was an ecumenical seminary. It's considered fairly progressive in terms of seminaries. And in my scripture classes, we would spend 12 weeks or however long the semester was reading about the historical critical method of scriptural interpretation, which were all written by men. And then we would spend one day on other interpretations, which was feminist, queer, black interpretations of scripture. And then we would be done with that. And so I do think that this, I'm going to give them credit. This was a decade ago. So I guess maybe things have changed since then. But I do think there's something about like who gets to interpret scripture, and that maybe for many of us, even those of us who were reading and studying scripture, the Magnificat and just female characters in general weren't a huge focus of our study.
So it sounds like this three-part podcast series that we're putting together could be valuable to a lot of people.
And one of the things that we have seen here at US Catholic is that there really is a hunger to learn more about Mary. Right? We've done a lot of resources about Mary in the past 6 months. We had a special download for subscribers. We did another shorter download on the faces of Mary that we gave to people who signed up for our email list. Both of these, by the way, are still available to people who want to sign up for our emails or subscribe to our print magazine. And we got such a huge response to both of these resources that we knew that we had to kind of continue offering people resources to learn more about Mary in other ways, because there is such a hunger. And so, really, that's what we're going to do on this episode and the next two episodes of the podcast. Today, we're going to look at Mary from the perspective of feminist thought. Was Mary a champion of women's liberation? Can feminists, or should feminists, look to Mary for inspiration? Does it make sense to call Mary a feminist? I'm Emily Santa, one of the hosts of Glad You Asked.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day. Was Mary a feminist? To answer this question, we talked to Julie Hanlon Rubio. She is the Shea Hoyseman Professor of Christian Social Ethics and Associate Dean at Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University in Berkeley, California.
She's also the author or editor of 7 books. Most recently, Can You Be a Catholic and Feminist, published by Oxford University Press. She has published in a variety of academic journals as well as popular venues. She serves on the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops National Review Board.
Thanks for joining us on the podcast today, Julie.
It's great to be here.
Your most recent book is called Can You Be a Catholic and a Feminist? So, in the context of this question, what does feminist mean?
It's complicated. In one sense, to be a feminist is to identify as a feminist, to identify and say, I claim this identity as my own. And when people do that, they mean really different things by it. And in my book, I wanted to speak to people who are identifying as both Catholic and feminist, and people who identify as feminists but are not so sure about Catholic, and people who are Catholic but are a little worried about feminists. So in that sense, it's really broad. But I also wanted to offer a definition that I think captures what is essential to feminism in all its many forms. And so I say that a feminist is someone who believes in the equal dignity of women and men, who sees sexism that denies that dignity, and commits to doing something to change it. So it's both a theory and a practice, because feminism is both a way of thinking and a movement. And then in its contemporary manifestations, it's also intersectional, which means that sexism intersects with other kinds of oppression, like those based in race or economics. So it's linked to social justice.
Now, often when people ask, can you be a Catholic and feminist, they approach the question as though feminism is the bad thing there or the dangerous thing, as though it might make someone a bad Catholic. But you're approaching it from a different angle. What's the crux of the challenge for people who identify as feminist and Catholic, as you explore in your book?
For sure. You can find lots of things on the internet that say that you can't be a Catholic and a feminist because feminism is problematic. Um, I approach it this way. There is a tension, a perceived tension and a real tension between these perceived identities. So for some people for whom Catholicism is deeply formative, especially a kind of traditional form of Catholicism, the feminist part is really hard. And for other people who have come to see themselves as feminists, the Catholic part is problematic. So it's hard on both sides. And my goal is to take readers beyond the sort of tensions at the surface and go deeper into both traditions. And in some cases, that actually makes the problem harder. Going deeper shows you more of the problem. But the flip side is also true, that going deeper also shows you where the commonalities are and where the potential is. And that to me is really exciting. So, for instance, I think, and I think this is surprising to some people, that there's more common ground on marriage, say, than most people would think. Maybe some traditional Catholics think that feminists are anti-marriage or anti-family. In my view, most feminists historically have been what I call marriage reformers, not anti-marriage crusaders. And Catholic teaching on marriage today is actually far more egalitarian than most people realize. So, a Catholic feminist version of marriage that emphasizes intimacy, mutuality, and the commitment to common good, that for me is where there's a lot of common ground and it's really compelling. So there are challenges on both sides, but also lots of potential.
Yeah, so moving to the question of the day, which is about Mary, I think there's this common critique of Mary among feminists, but even among other non-Catholic Christians, that Mary holds up these kind of unrealistic or limiting ideals of womanhood. She's pure, she's passive, she's without sin. Seems to be her only destiny or her other role. Is there a way to kind of challenge or reinterpret these ideals using kind of Catholic feminism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to acknowledge these critiques. There are serious reasons for doing so. So feminists have worried about what is sometimes called Marianismo, or perpetuation of this unrealistic ideal. Like you can only be a good Catholic woman if you're a virgin or a mother. And to be that person is to be like passive and sacrificial and always placing other people's needs above your own. And that can be really difficult. But I think, the problem is that of course, it's good to be compassionate and to serve other people and to put other people above your own needs. I mean, that's part of what being a Christian is all about, right? But a Catholic feminist would argue that that kind of compassion and service is for everyone, not just for women. That it's also virtuous to love yourself, to love your neighbor as yourself, and that women and men can live that out in so many different ways, in public and in private. So it's an ideal for all of us, as long as it's balanced. And there are just, if you look at the Christian tradition, so many different versions of living that thing out. But the problem is that if women are already socially encouraged to be sacrificial, which they are in our society, but especially, I mean, I just got back from spending a few months in El Salvador. I mean, especially in the global South and other places in the world, then to layer this message on top of that can be seriously dangerous. For example, leaving women to live in situations of to stay in situations of sexual or physical violence. And it can truncate their potential because not all women are called to motherhood or virginity. So I think feminist theologians also argue that this ideal, which is of course like socially shaped, is not even fully faithful to the gospel because Mary is not just is not just passive, is not just a mother, is not just a virgin. And if we go deeper into the gospel, we'll actually see something um, that's very different, right? That's very different, but that can also, again, be lived out in different ways.
So Catholics often have this portrayal of Mary as the most powerful woman in Christian history, that, the most important saint. So she's a model for Catholic women, and that means that the church must not be sexist because it elevates Mary. Um, but is this view problematic? Does this obscure the reality of actual historic um, lack of power that women had, or could it alternatively be a starting point for something more constructive?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting that this is often or more often what we're hearing about Mary today. It's not actually that she's passive. It's that she's strong. Sometimes if people have like a tattoo or a T-shirt of Mary, the Mary of the Magnificat, who's crushing the serpent, right? She's strong, and there's something to that, right? I think feminist theologians also have said, yeah, look at this woman. She is young and pregnant and courageous, and she says yes to God's call. She is a prophet. If you look at her Magnificat and what she tells us about this liberating God. Her husband almost leaves her because he's worried about how she got pregnant, right? Um, she gives birth in a barn. She tells her son it's time for his first miracle, and she stays faithful to the very end. I mean, yeah, she's stronger than maybe marrying piety tells us some of the time, right? And that's good. Um, But I mean, I think we also have to be realistic about, yes, the kind of power Mary would have had in her time, what the status of women was in her time. Certainly, there was not equality, the kind of equality that we take for granted, at least in some places today. So we need to be realistic about that and also realistic about the limits of Mary's role, even in the Christian tradition. It's interesting to me that we actually rarely hear about the Magnificat, um, right? I mean, the much more common is to pray the Hail Mary, but and so all of Mary's strength gets located in her pregnancy and her motherhood, and that also obscures, I think, the reality of women's lives, not only then but today. The lack of power that women have in their families and in their societies. So I think that it would be good to go back to the Mary of the Magnificat and retrieve what we can from that and listen to this Mary who talks about the God who throws down the mighty and lifts up the lowly. And also understand that Mary did not live in our times, right? And had a very different social situation than we do.
So, two very different visions of Mary and what Mary teaches women, Catholics of all genders today, right? And both are maybe not the right picture. So, what do you think is maybe a helpful way to think of Mary as a Catholic feminist today, right? Like, what are some things that we should keep or claim, and maybe what are some things that we should reinterpret or pass on?
Well, I think the Marianismo is something that has to pass away. So if for instance we're always telling girls or women to be like Mary, and if by that we mean to be quiet and passive and humble and all of that, that has to pass away. Um, girls and women in the Catholic tradition deserve a full range of models, um, and shouldn't just be limited to Mary, right? And so that has to pass away. I think there's more potential in thinking about the strength of Mary as a pregnant woman in a difficult situation. Um, but also, I've been really helped by Elizabeth Johnson, the theologian at Fordham's work on Mary. And she's helped me to see that Mary, if you look at Mary's dialogue with the angel, that it looks and sounds a lot like the dialogues when God, the God of the Hebrew Bible, calls other prophets. Structurally, it looks like that. And so Mary can be understood as a prophet. That totally reframed things for me, right? As someone who grew up not super interested in Mary, like, oh wow, that's what's going on there, and that she is then saying yes to her part in God's liberating story, right? In that way, I think there's something to reclaim, and not just for women, right, but for all of us.
So, what about the historical Mary? If we kind of cut through the layers of traditional devotion and the theology of Mary, um, can we, if we look at Mary of Nazareth, which is the way I tend to think of her when we're framing it historically, could she be viewed as a champion of women's liberation?
I don't think that she can be viewed as a champion of women's liberation, just because I don't think we have evidence that she was fighting for women. She was living her life. I don't think we have evidence that she saw sexism, right? Right. I mean, this is a modern thing, and so I don't think so. I think what we can see is that she was a strong woman, and sometimes that's what people mean by feminist, right? But and it's important to recognize her as that. And traditional devotions can cover that up. I think it's hard to see that strong Mary in some of the devotions that are most central in the Catholic tradition. So, so insofar as the tradition encourages us to pray in or through her, asking for special things, or when we're really desperate, or we or encourages us to not go to God, or to think of ourselves as sinners and to pray with worry about what might happen at the hour of our death. I'm sure there's a place for that, but I'm sure there's also a place to recover some of Mary's power. And I wonder what would happen, for instance, if we prayed with with the Magnificat, and if we're praying of Mary talking about that liberation God, and then we might also say, ask God for the courage to say yes in the ways I'm called to participate in God's liberating action today. That's a Marian prayer, but it's not the Marian prayer we're used to hearing.
You mentioned Elizabeth Johnson and her understanding of Mary saying yes to God, taking on. And I think that maybe that's one of the things that gets lost in the traditional devotion, right? There are a lot of feminists who argue that Mary's pregnancy was something that happened to her without her consent. And then there are others like Elizabeth Johnson who say that, well, the angel came to her and she gave her assent. God valued her agency. How do we kind of make sense of that moment in her life, or how do you make sense of that?
Well, I'm not an historian or biblical scholar, so I wouldn't consider myself an expert on those questions. But I do find compelling the arguments for Mary's agency in the story. It does seem as though there is a choice to be made, and we celebrate that choice. But I also think that um, these stories are among the stories that, say, New Testament scholars many would not have high confidence in their historicity, right? I mean, they would more see them as stories designed to tell us something about Jesus and something about God working in history. So I wouldn't want that to be the linchpin of my argument for women's agency. I think there are other places in the tradition where, for instance, in Catholic social thought and the dignity of the person and conscience and the idea that we all should be artisans of our destiny, that's there for all of us. So I don't think that we need to the whole thing to rest on this story. Although clearly, the story plays a really important role in Catholic tradition and Catholic art and Catholic iconography. So it's important to recover what we can.
Now you've clarified we don't want to be anachronistic and kind of like read feminism back into first century Palestine. But if we are looking at that time period and the culture Mary grew up in, are we aware of any traditions around women's identity or liberation, or even just, um, a woman's call to holiness, a woman's place in relation to God that would have inspired Mary?
I'm not sure, to tell you the truth about that. It's not something I'm aware of. Um, but I guess I would say also that it's hard to know because the Bible is less interested in individual characters than in communities. And so, we don't get to hear what inspired Mary. And so we're trying to draw it out of what other things that we know about the time periods. But I haven't found that kind of material. I guess where I might go is the work of Elizabeth Shusler-Fiorenza, New Testament scholar for so many years at Harvard Divinity School, who talked about the early Christian community as a discipleship of equals and of the God of Jesus as the liberating God, even associated with wisdom or Sophia. And insofar as Mary is a member of that community, right? She's there when Jesus returns among the disciples. She's there at the cross. If we think about Mary as disciple in that community, inspired by Jesus and the God that Jesus spoke of, then I think that we can see her as playing a part in the story of that liberating God.
I think way back in the first question, you mentioned intersectionality and that feminism is intersectional. And obviously, Catholic feminism looks very different in different cultures around the world. Can you talk a little bit about what global theologies teach us about reading Mary, as especially as a liberatory figure?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you look at all the different ways that Mary is portrayed in art, especially and in prayer and traditions around the world. Mary has a million different faces, and it seems important for people to portray Mary as looking like them. Right. And clearly, especially when God can feel just too large and too powerful to approach, it seems that Mary can be understood as having a brown face or a black face or an Asian, right? As looking like a mother that we might know. So, when I think about Our Lady of Guadalupe or Black Madonna, these traditions around the world, it seems important that people have made that connection. I would say, though, not to sort of rain on the party, um, but I think it's important that feminists, while celebrating those traditions, also are critical of those traditions and devotions and ask, even if Mary looks different, and in some ways is affirming of say the ethnic or racial part of people's identities in various cultures are we still are the same sexist elements still present? So it's possible that in the same devotion, we can have celebration or empowerment on the one hand, and also, say, a putting of women in a certain box with certain character traits and roles that are stereotypically feminine that feminists would see as problematic. So I think we have to do what feminists do in a lot of other places, critical retrieval. So look and see, oh, this is interesting. There's more going on here than just marrying Ismo. But it's also likely that the same things that we're worried about at home are going on there too, and need to be critically engaged.
So to kind of funnel all of this down into one question, can we call Mary a feminist?
So for me, not technically. What makes sense to me is that feminism is a modern world and it indicates an identity marked by certain beliefs and certain practices. And so it's anachronistic. But if by feminists you mean a strong woman, and for Christians, a strong woman who found her role in God's liberating project, maybe so.
So we always ask our guests the same question at the end of our conversation, which is, what is one thing that you would like our listeners to take away from this discussion?
I'd like listeners to think about Mary with an open mind, both critically and appreciatively. What feminist theologians do really well is go deep into the traditions and recover things that are not necessarily close to the surface. They help us criticize and look critically at what we're doing, but then retrieve things in the tradition that actually can be more life-giving and reconstruct in ways that can be empowering. For me, this is what makes being Catholic and feminist exciting. What is on the surface is not enough for me, and I think it's not enough for a lot of women and men. But with the critique, the retrieval, and the reconstruction, this is a faith I can live with, and I hope it's a faith that many listeners can live with too.
Well, that's all our questions for today. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
Emily, I really enjoyed that conversation we had with Julie. Was there anything that stood out to you or surprised you?
There were a lot of little things that she would say that I would stop and go, huh, yeah. I think one of them was she mentioned this line about areas of overlap between Catholics and feminists and how there are there's more congruence than people think. And so one of the examples she gave was marriage, right? That a lot of Catholics and a lot of feminists assume that they don't agree when it comes to marriage, but really Catholic teaching on marriage is pretty egalitarian, and that there's actually a lot of overlap. And I just thought that struck me, and it's something that's so important to remember. It's so important to notice those moments of congruence, especially now when just like any two sides of anything just are becoming so more and more polarized. Doesn't matter what the issue is.
It's funny because I sometimes get really annoyed by the discourse about how we have to find common ground. But this is a perfect example of where finding common ground seems like an excellent idea, partially simply to strengthen a culture that recognizes things like human dignity and consent in relationships. I do think that this highlights just how much kind of gray area or ambiguity there is both within the realm of Catholic thought and in the realm of feminist thought, because even while she was talking about that, I was already thinking of particular Catholics who might push back against more, I guess, developed ideas on the theology of marriage. And at the same time, thinking of some of the more radical feminist movements that would want to jettison marriage entirely. But yeah, there's, as she said, so much overlap.
How about you? Was there anything else that surprised you?
I think I was surprised and glad that she was so willing to critique Marian devotions and traditions, because I think sometimes in our eagerness to find stuff that's liberatory in certain traditions, we will deliberately ignore stuff that isn't. And I think we also have an understandable reluctance to critique devotions and traditions from cultures that are not our own. And I was glad that she was able to name and call out the reality that a lot of Marian devotions, historically and culturally and globally, contain these kind of latently problematic elements relating to demanding women's subservience.
Yeah, I had really mixed feelings about that because on the one hand, like, yes, 100%, I agree with her and you. And on the other hand, there was part of me that was like, can't we have anything? Right? Like, can't women, especially maybe women to whom feminism is important or consider themselves feminists, like, can't we just have one piece of the church that we can unqualifyingly look up to?
That's a really good question, isn't it? Um, you know, at what point does our critique become so extensive that we've kind of critiqued ourselves into a wasteland? I don't know.
I guess this is a question that we've never asked each other, but like, where do you come down on the issue? Do you think that we can call Mary a feminist? Is that even the right question?
This is a good question for us to ask, yeah, because it's a hard one. I personally wouldn't call Mary a feminist only because I try to be respectful of like historical categories and using terminology correctly. But I do think that we can look to Mary for feminist inspiration. And in fact, I tend to kind of come down a little bit more on the side of, yeah, she was actually pretty radical. It's just that the concept of feminism wasn't around. How about you?
Yeah, this seems like the wrong question to me, right? Instead of asking, was Mary a feminist? Maybe can feminists look to Mary, or maybe to steal the title of Julie's book, can Catholics be feminist? Can Christians be feminist? It does seem a little anachronistic to me, this question. I then just keep running up against, well, what is feminism? Which I know Julie explained, defined for us, but
Well, that kind of leads into the next question. Was there anything else you wanted to ask Julie about?
I think Julie did a really great job of pushing back against Mary as a feminist while also kind of showing how Mary can be a model for all of us seeking more egalitarian ways of interacting with each other. And one thing that we didn't talk about is what impact this has not just on women, but on men, or people of any gender, right? Like, how, if Mary is truly this model of like overthrowing empire, what does that mean for Catholic masculinity?
Ooh, that's a really valuable perspective to take. It's funny because I just saw a social media post, I think it was this morning, and it was something like women need to be Christ-like and feminine. And I know that the post didn't actually mean to say that women needed to be Christ-like because Jesus was feminine, but I thought what an interesting accidental idea that is there. The idea that, Mary, if Mary was the one who was closest to Jesus and most like Jesus and actually genetically connected with Jesus, what does that say about what it means to be a perfect disciple, to be a perfect follower of Jesus?
Yeah, I think that so often, perhaps because women, Catholic women, are like really thirsting for spiritual models, there gets to be this assumption, this kind of like easy thing to say, like, well, Mary, women look to Mary, women be like Mary, whatever your perception of what that means looks like. If you're, seeing Mary as the ideal mother or Mary as the revolutionary, what does it mean to kind of go one step further and say, like, well, no, anyone who follows Christ needs to be more like Mary? And how do we build a Catholic masculinity that is secure enough to say, like, yeah, I'm like Mary?
I wanted to ask Julie, even though the concept of feminism wasn't around, I know that there were in different cultures these kind of like proto feminist figures who wrote in defense of what would now be considered women's rights. And there were also, even aside from people who were, making it theoretical, we have this whole tradition that Mary was tying into of women who served God and how often their service of God involved doing stuff that was pretty subversive, honestly. And I did want to ask, how Mary, as a good Jewish woman who had grown up understanding what a good Jewish woman does, she would have looked to people like Judith and Esther and Jael and the matriarchs, none of whom were docile and submissive. And I try to envision her. I don't know whether Mary even knew how to read. So, whether she's reading the stories or hearing them, how those would have struck her, especially as a young woman in an occupied territory. I think when we talked to Kelly Nikondeha, she talked about Kelly Nikondeha has written about kind of liberation theology and connecting it with Palestine and talking about how Mary would have seen her own people being oppressed by these imperial invaders and how, that would have inspired her Magnificat. And I just wonder how she maybe connected those feelings to the stories of the women from Hebrew scripture.
So I feel like we're getting closer and closer to our final question, which is, if you were going to preach a sermon, what would it be about?
If I were going to preach a sermon on Mary, I would ask people to go back and look at those few little stories we have about her and to, without the interference of all of these layers of interpretation that we've picked up over centuries, and see who Mary really is in the Bible. And to allow themselves to be kind of struck anew by how daring she was in each one of these scenes, and to reflect on what this means for us in our call to the Christian life.
Well, now I can't get my previous idea out of my head, and I think I would preach a sermon on Mary as a model for everyone, not just women, and as an example of what it means to be a true disciple of Jesus, and connect this to feminism and how feminism is often seen to be kind of a project of an angry woman, when really feminism, or any sort of kind of search for equality, raises everyone up and teaches everyone how to be a better person.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week for the next episode about Mary, where we talk about Mary the Revolutionary.
Glad You Asked was made possible by the support of our sponsors, the Claretian Missionaries. The Claretian Missionaries in the United States and Canada are seeking young men who feel called to grow in their relationship with God and to serve others. To explore a vocation with the Claretian community, please visit myclaret.org.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Santa, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.